want to talk about the first time you were in the WWF under Vince McMahon Sr. When you first met him, you met Vince Jr. at the same time. What was your first impression of the Vinces?
Well, when I went in to do a tryout promo, what they call a dark promo, they film it but they don't air it. So they wanted to have me do this in front of the audience, but only for their looking at and filming. So Mr. McMahon Sr. said, Sarge, I want you to go out and do a promo with my son. And I said, which one is he? I'd never met him. And he said, he's the one with the really cool looking hairdo there. And he said, you know, he charges or gets charged $300 or $400 for a haircut. I said, what? And he said, yeah, that's the kind of son I have. He's got to do everything all the way. And I said, okay. So I was told to get ready to go out, and Mr. McMahon Sr. said, is there anything I can help you with to go out to your promo? So I reached in my bag, and I had a cassette tape, and it was the Marine Corps hymn. So I handed it to him. I said, can you play this? And he said, well, what is it? I said, this is the Marine Corps hymn. Can you play it on the loudspeakers? And he said, music? You want to go out to music? And I said, yeah, I thought I'd try it, you know. And he said, I never thought about that. Let's see if we can do it. So he left and came back, and he said, yeah, they get it all queued up. When you hear your music, you go out and do your promo with my son. I said, okay. So the music played, and I walked out, and as I was ready to make my entrance, Mr. McMahon Sr. grabbed me and pulled me back, and he was like listening to the reaction of the crowd because they'd never had music before. And so finally he shoved me out, and I had, of course, my campaign cover on and my glasses, and I had a whistle and my swagger stick and a big cigar sticking out of my mouth, and had the fatigues on, the combat boots, and headed to Vince, we'll call him Vinny, or Vincent Kennedy, whatever. And I should call him Trouble. But anyway, so I started walking out, and nobody knew who I was, never saw me before, and I started calling them maggots and scums and slimes and pukes and stand up and salute Sgt Slaughter. And by the time I got to Vinny, they were coming over the railing. You know, here's a guy they never even saw. So he went right into his character, and, well, what do we have here? You know, and I went right up to his face, and of course I slobber. They call me Sgt Slaughter. And I laid it in on him. And I said, shut your hole, puke. Who gave you permission to speak? And it startled him. So I said, stand at attention, get that stomach in, and put that chest out. Of course, he wanted that. He liked that. So I walked around him, and I did this promo, and finally I got to the point where I took my swagger stick and I started roughing up his hair right above his ear. And he started giving me the shoulder, like, don't do that, you know, like, cut that out. And so finally I stopped, and I went right to his ear, and I said, who cut your hair? Ray Charles? And he looked at me, and I could read his mind. He was going like, who's this son of a bitch talking to me like this, you know? And so I actually got to the best of him. So as I went to leave, he said, well, maybe we'll see Sgt Slaughter again later on. And so I said, well, that's my cigar. All exclamation point, the interview. Took a big swig of my cigar, turned around, and I blew it in his face, and I said, as you were, maggot. And little did I know he hates smoke. Doesn't want anybody around him that smokes. In fact, if you work in the office and you're a cigarette smoker, he'll fire you. So anyway, I didn't know that. You know? So I walked back to the dressing room, and all the talent that's still there, the wrestlers that are still left from the evening, they're kind of looking at me like, that poor guy, he lost his job before he can get started. So here comes Mr. McMahon, and he used to have like 4 quarters he would jingle in his hands. and it was kind of a nervous thing. So I'm taking my combat boots off, and I see these loafers walking around me, and about the fourth time they stop in front of me, and I finally get one boot off, and I looked up at him, and he's like shaking his head. And then he gave me this, never said a word. So I get up, I got one boot under my arm, and I'm hopping with the other foot and going to this back room. And same thing, he starts walking around me again, jingling those quarters, and he stops right in front of my face, just like I did his son. And he goes, "That's the greatest villain I've ever seen in this business. And I've seen them all. Even my son hates you. You need to start tomorrow." And I said, "Oh, well, good, thank you, but I can't start." At that time, I was still wrestling under a mask at Super Destroyer Mark II in the Minneapolis AWA territory. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll call Vergagne and get you out of that. You need to come here immediately." So that was my first time to meet Mr. McMahon Sr. and Jr.
And you were putting everyone in the Cobra Clutch earlier, which, they'll need to sign a waiver on the way out because you can't sue us. What made you come up with the Cobra Clutch as the finisher?
Well, I first started using the Cobra Clutch down in Kansas City, and Harley Race was the booker there. He had lost his title, the World NWA World title, and he bought into a territory, the Kansas City territory. And he needed a villain, so I came in, and same thing, he wanted me to do a promo. So I did a promo for him, and he came over to me and he said, "Kid, you and I are going to be married." And I went, "Oh, what's that mean?" I didn't know what that meant in the business. And that meant that you're going to wrestle the same guy every night. And he said, "You're going to hate me more than your wife by the time we get done with it." So I started using this Cobra Clutch, but I call it the Slaughter Clutch. And so one day he came to me and he said, "I think you should change the name of that to the Cobra Clutch." And I said, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea." Now, this is 1974, never knowing that I would ever be joining G.I. Joe, and their enemy is Cobra. So I think all the stars were lined up that night when Harley Race said I should change it to the Cobra Clutch. 11 years later, there I am on animated G.I. Joe fighting Cobra. So it all came around. It was pretty cool.
And because you've talked a lot about the famous alley fight with Pat Patterson, we all know about that. But when Vince Sr. brought you in, you had a big run with Bob Backlund around, Madison Square Garden, all these different places. How was that being put in all those main events with the champion and sort of being given that top spot?
Yeah, when you go to the WWE, they first put you on matches where your opponent couldn't beat your sister. And so you know you're going to win. You're going to beat them up pretty badly. Your matches are maybe 1-2 minutes. That's all it is. But and then you do some promos. But they never see you wrestle anybody. But your first match is with the world champion in Madison Square Garden. So you can imagine what that feels like. Here I am, my first match in Madison Square Garden. I'm up against Bob Backlund, the world champion. And it was unbelievable. I'm sitting in the locker room where I'm thinking of all the famous people that ever sat in that same place that I was. Singers, hockey players, basketball players, wrestlers. I just kind of was in awe. I'm still a fan of professional wrestling. I watch it all the time. It's what I grew up. When I was 3 years old, my father put me on his knee and let me watch wrestling on his knee. So I've always been a wrestling fan. I always will be a wrestling fan. And it just was incredible. You get there, and it's all hyped up for that one big match. And we had a match where I got Bob Backlund in the Cobra Clutch. A lot of people didn't know what the Cobra Clutch was, but I was using it and winning my matches on television. And that, all of a sudden, I get the world champion in the Cobra Clutch. Right before that, his manager, Arnold Skolin, was doing something at a ringside, had a cigar in his mouth, and I came along and I slapped him. And Bob Backlund got mad at that, so he went to swing at me and hit me, and I put him in the Cobra Clutch. So I got him in the Cobra Clutch, and the referee's lifting his arm. He's getting ready to submit, and I get hit over the head with a chair from Arnold Skolin because he got mad that I slapped him. My mistake. My mistake. I don't know if I would have got Bob in the Cobra Clutch or not, but here I had the world champion get ready to submit, and because I slapped his manager, he hit me over the head with a chair. I won the match, but because of a disqualification from outside interference, I went, oh, my God, here I am. I was going to be the world champion. So Mr. McMahon Sr. was so impressed with it, he said, I want to have a rematch with you and Backlund because it really is, everybody wants to see that. But I can't do it the next time we're at the Garden because Bob has to go to Japan and defend the title for 3 or 4 weeks. I said, oh, darn. He said, but I got you in a replacement. I got a replacement for Bob. And I kept waiting for some name, and he goes, Bruno Sammartino. Bruno Sammartino. You know, the only time I ever saw Bruno was in a magazine. And now I'm going to be wrestling him my next time at Madison Square Garden. And so it was just a dream come true. And Bruno was at the height of his career. I mean, he was just about ready to head out. And next thing I know, here I am in Madison Square Garden in the middle of the ring, that squared circle with Bruno Sammartino, the living legend. And it doesn't get much better than that.
Well, obviously, you end up leaving WWF, and then you come back, you turn into the American Hero. In 1984, you're headlining one set of shows, Hulk Hogan's headlining the other. Was there ever any competition with you and Hogan in 1984 that you're both almost competing for the same spot? You're both the top guys. What was that like, your relationship at the time?
Well, I didn't have any competition. I just was happy with what I was doing. I was making a pretty good living, and I got so above, as Vince McMahon Jr. said to me. He said, "You're more popular than Hulk Hogan." He said, "So I'm going to put you with the Intercontinental Champion, and you're going to wrestle one show, and I'm going to put Hogan and the Tag Team Champions on another show, and we're going to do 2 shows a night." That was like a medal, putting a medal on your chest, because that wasn't ever done, where they could run 2 shows in the same night. So Hogan and I never saw each other. We sometimes I would wrestle 3 times on a Friday, 3 times on a Saturday, 3 times on a Sunday. And it was just crazy how busy we were. And I remember one time I went to a match. It was I was in the Capitol Center in Washington, D.C., and the night match was up in Pennsylvania somewhere. And they put me on a prop plane that sprayed fields. It was just me and the pilot. And I just barely had room for my bag, and we're flying to Pennsylvania, and I'm looking down and I'm thinking, boy, this is the life. You know, here I am in this prop plane, thinking, what happens if this thing goes down? I'm gone, you know, but that's the way it was. And we were on fire, as they say. And Hogan and I never really saw each other, talked to each other, but we were making WWF a whole lot of money. That's for sure.
Do you remember at that point, did you overhear Vince McMahon having a lot of conversations about taking the company national or going international? What were those conversations like? What were his aspirations?
Well, his first thought was to get all the other wrestling leagues together and do a worldwide wrestling thing. But he just wanted to have his name on it, World Wrestling Federation at that time. But he wanted to have everybody join him. So he went to each promoter and said, why don't we get together, be a team, and we'll be going all over the world. And none of them wanted to join him. So he just would go to TV stations while he was in town after he talked to them and got his show on their areas, you know, and that didn't make anybody too happy that was fighting to, you know. Vince McMahon's father always told me he didn't like that. He didn't want him to do that. He said, you can't go in your neighbor's backyard. Never go in your neighbor's backyard. There's plenty for everybody. And that was his mindset. So when his son was, you know, had this idea, he kept saying, Vinny, don't do that. Don't do that. You're going to make a lot of people upset, which he did. And so that's the way he started it, and nobody would go with him, so he went on his own. And I know WrestleMania, the first WrestleMania, he hawked his house. He everything he had was on WrestleMania. If WrestleMania wasn't a success, I don't know where he would be today, because he put everything he had on that idea of WrestleMania.